I mean, that's a human life. And other people sort of at the aggregate level are making these judgments about the value of someone's life. And this is completely anti-human, and it has an underlying, highly misanthropic thrust to it.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Ashley Frawley on the dangers of becoming blasé about human life and what she's learned from Canadians who withstood pressure to choose assisted death.
What we need to do is we have to think, because I think those in power bank on us just seeing things at the very surface level. These very simple arguments, and then they try to scare people as well. Your death is going to be horrible, painful death, painful death. And yeah, we're afraid of that.
Ashley says the drive to keep improving life is what makes human beings great.
We expect progress. That's not hubris. I think that's a reasonable expectation for people to have, that we will extend life, that every moment of life will be made better, and that we will want to live it for as long as possible. I mean, that is an expectation that goes back to the Enlightenment, to the very beginning of the progressive era. When we give that up, we have given up on progress altogether.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with journalist, author and sociologist Ashley Frawley. Ashley, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, the risk of sounding dramatic, it feels like we're entering some kind of death culture phase, or at least a kind of anti-life culture. I mean, there's babies on one end that we'll get onto, but there's also the kind of assisted death movement. You're originally from Canada, so you have a bit of a head start on this subject. What would you say to British people who are still mulling it over?
Yeah, well, it's amazing because I didn't give it any thought. You know, I saw the debate happening in Canada, almost a decade ago now. And I'm quite libertarian, quite a liberal type, and I just thought, yeah, choice at the very end of life, just for people who are suffering greatly, and it sounded fine, and I said nothing. And it wasn't until I started to see a few stories trickling out from Canada that I started to realize that something really bad was happening, that assisted dying had not happened, had not come to the fore because we were becoming more liberal as a society, but because we were becoming more blasé about human life, that human lives, particularly people with disabilities, people at the very end of life, were being seen as expendable and costly. And I think that's quite an anti-human thing, actually, the complete opposite of the impulse that I thought was driving it, which was, about autonomy and freedom. And I started to become very suspicious, particularly, after 2 years of lockdown, where autonomy, choice, freedom, these were all dirty words. And then suddenly people are falling all over themselves to champion autonomy, choice, and freedom in this one particular area. And, people will say, oh, well, of course you can have choice as long as it doesn't harm other people. And that's very interesting because that means the one choice that you can have is to end your life. Because if you understand human beings as fundamentally harmful, if you think about like the human footprint, this is a negative thing, then the one choice you can have is to end your life, because then you're ending the harm of your human footprint. And that's terrible. That's terrible. And thinking about older people, that should be, the fact that we have so many older people should be an incredible success for our societies, that we're living so much longer, that we're able to live so much beyond work. People are able to retire, and this is seen as a negative thing. And people are more and more openly saying, in the Netherlands and Belgium, even we've had this debate in the UK, people have openly said this, that after a certain age, it might be your civic duty really to see yourself out. Why? Because you're too costly. I mean, that's a human life. And other people sort of at the aggregate level are making these judgments about the value of someone's life. And this is completely anti-human, and it has an underlying, highly misanthropic thrust to it that doesn't really see the value of human life at all, and is therefore able to see them as expendable.
It's almost 10 years since Matthew Paris wrote, "Soon we will accept that useless life should end." So at the time it felt a bit like, that's so far out, it doesn't matter so much, but now it feels almost tangible what he was saying there. How do you see this idea that some lives are expendable and some aren't?
Well, he made this argument recently, again, in the Times. And I wrote an article for Unheard arguing against him, where he says, you know, people say, oh, what if some people wind up being urged to end their lives? And he says, I think that's definitely going to happen, and that's a good thing. And this is awful. And the story that really changed my mind was the story of Roger Foley, who, instead of, you know, he has a very complex disability that gives him limited usage of his arms and legs, and he needs quite complex and costly forms of community care in order to live, but he wants to live. Over the course of me becoming more aware of this and then speaking out against it, he actually got in touch with me, and I've talked to him more. And you know, he has hopes, he has dreams, and he wants to write a book, and he wants to continue writing music. He'd been a musician, and these are things that he can do with, you know, with the right accessibility, with the right, you know, tools. But he is continually offered assisted dying instead of assisted living. And luckily, he had the wherewithal to record some of these conversations that they were having with him in the hospital, where they were reminding him of the cost of his hospital stay and saying, look, you have a choice here. You're going to pay upwards of $1,500 a day to stay in hospital, which he obviously couldn't afford. They forced discharge into the community with limited assisted living, which he must have assisted living in order to survive in the community. So he would eventually die in the community with very limited care, or assisted dying. And this was the choice that he was offered. Now, how many, and actually, they almost convinced him. They were like, you know, it's about autonomy and choice, and this is your choice, and yay for. And then suddenly he snapped out of it, and he thought, no, this is wrong. I want assisted living. I don't want to die. If I had that, I wouldn't be asking for assisted dying. But how many people, and he knows people too, didn't have that self-confidence, didn't snap out of it, and actually went down that route? A lot of people do, because we no longer see the value of these lives. Well, you're just a cost to the world. Which is shocking, because the great progress of the disability movement was recognizing that, you know, your life's not a tragedy, that your life still has value, even if you happen to use a wheelchair, even if you happen to have different ways that you need to do things. And now, you know, I've been doing debates, and I'm sitting there on the line on the radio, and you know, they've got phone-ins and so on, and even MPs will say this. Oh, well, you know, if it happens that I can't use my arms and legs, and I need help, and I lose control of my my bowel movements, this sort of thing, you know, obviously I'll want to be euthanized. I'm like, that's just everyday life for a lot of people with disabilities. And you're just sitting here saying, that is a life that doesn't have dignity. Obviously, euthanize someone in that situation. What do you mean, obviously? You know, every single one of us is going to fall apart eventually. Every single one of us is going to die. Every single one of us is going to go through this process where we will become ill. But you're still living even when you are ill. You are still alive. And then unfortunately, this was all very academic to me. Unfortunately, you know, I saw something that was going wrong, and I thought, I have to speak out against this. But then unfortunately it really hit home, because a close family member of mine was diagnosed with cancer in Canada. And they had made judgments about the value of his life, and about, you know, whether or not it was worthwhile to continue fighting. There was absolutely no urgency. First of all, he was not even told that he had cancer. So it was found when he was at stage 3, and it was treatable. And then they dragged their feet, didn't even tell him he had cancer, until finally he goes back to the doctor, and they were like, oh, you have cancer. And then they set an appointment to stage it months down the line, because they know the longer we wait, this problem's going to take care of itself, essentially. And we were begging, pleading, why is this appointment way out here? And then finally we get the results, and they were like, oh, well, it's stage 4 now. There's nothing we can do. And didn't even tell him about any treatments, nothing. Offered him nothing. But my family member is Indigenous, my family is Indigenous. And he was quite certain that part of the judgment that was made on the part of the doctors was that he was Indigenous. And there was a very strong underlying current, you know, oh, well, is it alcohol? You know, this cancer was probably a lifestyle thing. And the doctors probably didn't bank on him having quite an educated family member. And I threw myself into learning about his condition, and there actually was a treatment. It was just very costly. And we begged and pushed and pressed. And they were like, there's no point here. You know, there's no point. There's a high potential of recurrence. But they were making a judgment about whether or not there was a point. You know, the difference between those few years, and this person was not old. It's not an older person, like, you know, in their 80s or something like that. He's still caring for a 17-year-old. And, you know, it's a difference between your grandchildren knowing who, or your children knowing who you are, having living memories of you, and just seeing you in pictures. You know, those months are when things need to be said. The judgment is yours to make about whether or not your life has value. But the doctors had made that judgment for him. Anyway, so we pushed for this treatment, and in the end he got it. He's not cancer-free. He's not cancer-free. He's playing hockey, back to normal life. But he had been given, that was it. It was the right thing to do here is to die, because this is just way too costly. And you see this kind of, this feeling on the part of medical professionals, really going back. I mean, Susan Sontag talked about this in the 70s, about how doctors were getting annoyed with the hubris and the rising expectations of the population. That they think, oh, your body can just break down and medicine will fix you. Well, yes, we do expect that, because we expect progress. We expect progress. That's not hubris. I think that's a reasonable expectation for people to have, that we will extend life, that every moment of life will be made better, and that we will want to live it for as long as possible. I mean, that is an expectation that goes back to the Enlightenment, to the very beginning of the progressive era. When we give that up, we have given up on progress altogether. Just accept the inevitable. Well, no. As a human being, what makes us great, what makes us so much beyond animals, other animals, is that we refuse to accept the inevitable. We refuse to succumb to fate. That is why we are in our, you know, wonderful conditions of modernity, far, far better than we were in the 11th century, the 7th century, whatever it might be, that we live in comfort because we refuse to accept that the way things are is the way that they're always going to be. And now it's pressing upon us everywhere. Just give up. Just give up. And I think when we give up on that fundamental part of us that demands more and better and that refuses to accept fate, we have given up entirely on progress.
Just going back to the Roger Foley, your interview that you did with him, people should go to your Patreon and watch it. It was really quite touching.
Yeah.
So it's an
I
online.
cried, actually.
Yeah, he's in his hospital bed.
Yeah.
And then he's telling you about the nurses who are just coming to him and saying, why don't you finish your life? And yeah, did it affect you?
Yeah, it was so much more touching than I expected. And I don't know why. And I said earlier, you know, for me it was a bit academic, and I felt guilty about that, because when we finished the interview, he said, I just want to thank you for speaking up for us, and for working so hard so that people like me can get the care that we need, and we won't get pushed into dying, so that people will see the value of our lives. And I felt terrible, because I hadn't. When I saw it happening, I didn't say anything. I didn't think about it. I didn't think. I just thought, yeah, that sounds fine. And I think what we need to do is we have to think, because I think those in power bank on us just seeing things at the very surface level. These very simple arguments, and then they try to scare people as well. Your death is going to be horrible, painful death, painful death. And yeah, we're afraid of that. As a society, we're afraid of becoming disabled. We're afraid of death. And the only time we can ever have an open social conversation about death is when it's in this like sanitized bureaucratic procedure that promises to be clean, predictable. Set the date of your death. It will be on Tuesday, you know, and you can, and then it takes all the stigma and all the fear out of it, and people like that. But you know, people do die. Normal deaths, good deaths. We have palliative care. We have huge advances in pain relief, and we need to continue to advance that. We need to continue to invest in palliative care. We have the possibility of palliative care that can reduce the pain at the end of life enormously and the fear of death, but it is costly. It is expensive, and it is unpredictable. And it is a lot cheaper if you can just say, okay, I'm going to die on this particular day. And that's it. And obviously, people want to pour money into that because it's a tiny investment compared to the enormous investments of end-of-life care, costly cancer treatments, that we've got to the point now where the National Health Service is this wonderful, great system. We're all supposed to sort of prostrate ourselves before the hallowed NHS, as long as no one ever uses it. It's like this, ideally, in the eyes of those running healthcare in a lot of countries that have public healthcare, is that, and also in the United States, which is a whole other issue, is that it should just be an information service. We should remain healthy. It's about health promotion. Why do we have this National Health Service when really it treats ill health? So it should keep you healthy. And that's the idea, that you should remain healthy. You should undergo all of these rituals of self-care. And then when you become ill, it's like, well, you've done something, and it's wrong to be, trying to draw so many resources to fight the inevitable. So, remain healthy throughout your life, and when inevitably your body breaks down, show yourself a quick exit kind of thing. And this is entirely anti-progressive, and it's a completely different idea of, an older vision of the body as a vehicle that gets you somewhere. A vehicle that allows you to do things. It's completely secondary to, what you actually want to be and do. It's just this like annoying fleshy thing that that you hold you back sometimes. But in this new paradigm of health, this new way of thinking, the body's like a temple, and the whole purpose of life is to keep this temple, holy. And when you become ill, it's like a new kind of sin, and you have sinned. And this is what happened to my family member. When he became ill, it was like, you have sinned. This is a lifestyle thing. It wasn't in the end. It was caused by a bacteria or something like that, we learned. But at the time, there was a very strong idea, like, this is a lifestyle thing. And you see that all the time in the culture as well. Like, oh, really, should we be treating these people who have these lifestyle things? Well, yes, every illness is a lifestyle issue because all living will eventually lead to death. But there's a sense that, like, you should keep yourself healthy. This is what we ought to do.
I mean, it's kind of natural that people would fear death or fear becoming disabled or bad things happening to them. But taking advantage of that to push certain things is not natural. It feels the same as with the COVID times, that fear was capitalized on to make certain things happen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because we talk about anxiety, like, oh, there's an epidemic of anxiety. But what people don't mention is the fact that anxiety is, in our culture, something that is positively pushed. It's an attribute of a good citizen. A good citizen is constantly anxious. You're supposed to be anxious. You're supposed to be aware. You're supposed to be aware of the myriad social problems. You're supposed to be aware of the myriad health risks. You're supposed to be body conscious. Are you testicle aware? Are you breast aware? You should constantly submit yourself to all of these kinds of examinations. You are supposed to be anxious as a good citizen because you're supposed to constantly be undergoing this kind of health surveillance to keep yourself healthy. And if you have failed to do that, this is an old idea in anthropology and sociology, that riskiness is like a new sort of religious, it's a new kind of religious feeling. It's a new kind of religious, it's like prayer, being aware of risks and mitigating against them through all of these rituals, these anti-risk rituals. No matter how small the risk, for a parent, no matter how small the risk, the virtuous parent always acts against it. And if you don't do that, you have sinned. You've put your child at risk. And so, this sort of anxiety is actually pushed by our culture, and then it is capitalized on. It's capitalized on by those who want to pass laws that are anti-freedom, that are anti-free speech. Because if you big up all of these risks, right, everything, you just have this huge growth industry of risks, because everybody knows that the end point of freedom is harm to other people. If you have any debate about freedom, someone will be like, well, what about harm? And so this creates this whole harm industry, this whole risk industry of all these millions of tiny little risks. And you think, well, why can't I have the freedom to eat a biscuit? Because the risk of obesity and the risk of this. And so then that allows us to give away freedoms bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. And it allows all sorts of policies to come in that have all kinds of ulterior motives that are ostensibly to mitigate against risk and that will alleviate our anxiety. So with death, we have this anxiety about death, this fear of death, and they will absolutely feed that. They will feed that. But the reason why assisted dying is becoming powerful is not because anybody in power cares about our autonomy. Absolutely not. They care about our autonomy in no other sphere of life except this one. And in Canada, they will euthanize prisoners while they are in shackles.
Really?
Yes. Is that choice? Is that autonomy? Is that a country that cares about freedom? There's serious ethical issues when the person's choice is to either go back to prison or die. People who try to get compassionate, their sentences reduced on compassionate grounds, and they refuse. They go, well, okay, then I'll die. It's not a choice.
No.
It's not a choice. There's no care about choice. And then the people who are actually pushing it, shamelessly, are insurance companies. And it's amazing when you go through the people who are at these conferences, and the people who, in Belgium will just openly say, the chief of one of Belgium's largest insurance companies said, well, we're just going to have to expand our euthanasia program because we can't afford all these old people. Literally just outright says that. They don't care. It's climate change organizations. They don't care about autonomy. They're worried about population. And so there are all sorts of ulterior motives. There's a very thin veneer of all this talk of autonomy. But what it is these people with ulterior motives push anxiety, push fear, and then they capitalize on it to do whatever they want.
Join us for part 2 of this interview when Ashley talks about falling birth rates and the dangers of a society that doesn't live for the next generation.
The idea of having children as an ideal is an extremely important expression on the part of our society of commitment to the future. And when fewer and fewer people are able to make that commitment, or where many more people are refusing consciously to do that, they are abdicating responsibility for the future.
Ashley says families are under attack from our institutions and our lifestyles.
They don't talk about mothers. This word mother is a dirty word. And so the family really is seen as this very, very negative thing. And family breakdown is seen as good. It's great, inevitable. Eventually, it's just on its way to the final dissolution, that there just won't be families anymore.